All right, welcome back to chapter 6, video number 4. We're going to be taking a look at passing arguments to parameters and some of the subtleties that are involved when doing that with methods. So this is when we're not using a void method, but we're actually passing something into a method because we want to use some kind of a variable. Now we've seen this before with statements like this message box show. And the show method right here, we're passing an argument and it's called hello. Of course, we could argue, we could say hello world, we could argue whatever we want in there. So this is a string value that we're passing into the method called show that will eventually display that message. So that's a sample of what an argument is. Now the parameter is a variable that receives the argument that's passed into the method. So down here, this is another private void method that we're going to pass information into, and in this case we're going to pass in a parameter. So it's going to receive an argument, but the parameter here is called value, and that has to have a certain, it's a variable, so it has to be declared with a certain type. In this case it's an int, and then we're going to take that right there and we're going to pass it. So whatever this variable is right here, the content, or whatever was entered in as the argument into that parameter, gets entered into here and gets passed into the method and gets replaced right here with this value right there. All right, so how does that look? Okay, so we could pass, here's an example of how we could pass, let's say, an integer value into there. So if this is your code, we've declared a variable called x, and it's an integer, and we initialized it to 5, and then we execute, or we activate a method here called display the value of x. What that's going to do, it's going to call this void method. We're going to pass the x into here. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to take that 5 and we put it into the x, so we're end up going to take this x parameter, pass it into the method here, into value, so value will become 5, and then take the value and then pass it into the method, and that becomes 5 as an integer. So the value is an integer, we're passing it as an integer, but because it's an integer and we're trying to show it, we cannot show an integer, we have to show a string, so we're going to use a method here called toAstring. So the output of this would be simply just a message box that would display the number 5. Now, if we were to do that, let's say we wanted to do something a little more complicated, we could pass this right here, this argument right here. Now that's 5 times 4, and we're in brackets, so we have to do the calculation first. It comes up with 20. So then the 20 basically repeats this process. It goes back up, puts it inside here as 20, passes the value back in here, and now it converts it and says the message box is now 20. All right, so that's how we can pass an argument into a method and then have that method transfer it back into the statements within inside of it. The note there is that we definitely want to make sure that whenever we're passing a particular argument into the parameter, that the parameter that's passing are the same type. In this slide, in number 14, arguments and parameter data types, they're re-emphasizing the point that if you're going to pass a string argument into a string parameter, they have to be the same. You can do that. You can pass an int to an int, of course, but you cannot pass a double or a decimal into an int data type. Because the nature of the data types have different sizes of how much information they can store. Of course, a decimal and a double are, I think, 8 bytes compared to an integer, which is 2 bytes. Of course, it's not going to fit. On the other hand, though, you can pass either a double or an int, let's say an int argument, into a double, because the int is only 2 bytes and I think the double is 8 or 16 bytes, so it basically has room to put it in there. But you can't put in a double into an integer, it just doesn't have the room. Similarly, we have the same idea where we can pass either an integer into a decimal. Because of course the integer is only 2 bytes, the decimal is probably, I think, 8 or 16. So you can pass it because it's got lots of room to do that. So keep in mind that it has to be equal. If you don't, it's going to throw an error.